Now, our first keynote speaker is Erfan Daliri. He is an incredible human being with an incredible set of stories to tell us. He also works in a space that I'm also very passionate about, the place where change makers can really make a difference, a place where we acknowledge that some of the most incredible change makers also come from a place that is difficult and challenging. So the way that we look at change making is from a 360 point of view. We understand the challenges that the individual has in making those changes, and we understand the complexity of the systems in which they're making those changes too. And that fits in really beautifully to day 2, where a lot of the work that we're listening about and talking about and discussing is about a whole of ecology approach. So without further ado, I'd like to warmly welcome Irfin to the stage.
He was only 10. He was too young to understand what it meant to work 2 jobs and study while trying to raise a family and keep up with the rent, because he was only 10. He was old enough to have ever-growing wants and needs and expectations, old enough to know that he did not fit in at school and how to spell the word immigration, but not quite old enough to recognize the silent grief in the eyes of a father who was struggling to breathe. A man who was imprisoned at the age of 17 for his egalitarian beliefs, and then spent the rest of his life in exile, a migrant, a greasy wog Persian refugee. This boy was just a kid who thought his father was a king with the world at his feet. Little did he know of his father's sleepless nights as he struggled to resist defeat. A man whose universal orbit was his wife and 3 kids. Not once did he raise his hands on them, no matter what they did. Instead, he worked with every ounce of his being to give them whatever they would want, never stopping to question whether they deserved it or not. This boy was oblivious to the weight already resting upon his father's shoulders as he watched him give his sisters piggyback rides like an unwavering soldier. In 1984, with an empty suitcase, a wife and a 1-year-old son, he came to this country and decided he'd be stopped by no one, not even that university lecturer who pointed him out to a theatre full of students, saying, "What will this man ever make of himself? Why are we taking in these useless immigrants?" His broken English left him incapable of coming up with a response on the spot. But his son is now a grown man, and his mouth is a cannon's barrel, and the pen in his hand is a loaded Glock. You see, that camel rider you taunted that day somehow managed to raise a squid. And he's educated, eloquent, well-versed, and he's got some ink to spit. He's lyrically armed with philosophical napalm, and he refuses to be calm. So if I was you, I'd raise the alarm, because it's about to do some harm to any narrow-minded ideologies that might come his way. Yes, I am the proud son of that greasy wog, and I'm happy to say that I'm a so-called illegitimate immigrant trying to shed a little bit of light on the plight of the Indigenous. To listen to this, as you sailed the 7 seas, you failed to see the land you landed on did not belong to you or me. It belonged to the Indigenous custodians, the traditional landowners, the ones you killed and slaughtered and labelled as the fauna. You see, before you merrily rowed your boat down the stream, colonising everything that you'd seen, this place we now call Australia was a land of the dream time. And Dad, there's something I want you to know that I don't often say out loud. And that is, you are my guiding light, my shelter in the storm, and of you I am proud. You might not realize this, but I remember what happened that day when I was 10. I didn't understand the significance of it at the time because I was only a child back then. But do you remember that day in McDonald's in Cairns when the girls and I came with you on that work trip? While Sepp, Raph and I ate our McMuffin meals and pancakes, and you would just sip on that tea that you had brought from home. As you checked the receipt, you asked me, "Is it possible for one man to say he ate all of this?" I thought you were just curious. So I said, "Yeah, sure, if he's a grommet." And you folded that receipt and you put it back in your wallet. I didn't realize then, but I know now why you didn't eat breakfast that day. You skipped that meal that morning because you didn't actually have enough money to pay. Your office had asked you to justify every cent that you spent, so you had to keep that receipt to get your reimbursement. You see, you couldn't actually afford to take your 3 kids with you from Townsville to Cairns, but when we asked you to take us that day, you did anyway because you were a selfless man. I remember those days. You used to go from the office straight to the restaurant and work non-stop, and then in the dead of night you'd ride your push bike home in the rain so you could finish your PhD on the injustices faced by the Indigenous mob. I remember those days. You used to hold your silent fasts just to put us through school and buy us birthday gifts, and though they might now be in the past, it is those memories that spur me on to write my mind, speak my mind, and create my art. Each and every one of your sacrifices have played their part in creating the man that now stands before you. It is to you that I owe my potentialities too. And that meal you skipped that day because you didn't have the money to pay has now paved the way for me to write the book that might help heal this broken world one day. Thank you. I would also like to acknowledge that we are gathering today on the land of the Palawa people of Lutruwita, and I'd like to pay my respects to the elders past, present and future of all the Aboriginal Tasmanian community, and to all elders past, present and future, to all of the First Nations, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander First Nations of this great continent. I'd also like to extend my warm welcome and acknowledgement to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander friends present here today and watching online. I'm honoured and humbled to be invited to speak here with you today. I don't take this lightly. I love what I do, and any opportunity to be in front of an audience and to share my work and my thoughts, I greatly, deeply appreciate. So I hope today is something that is useful to you and insightful to you, and I look forward to speaking with you all about this afterwards. I'd like to also extend my gratitude to Ros Abercrombie for your trust in my work and in my words, and for the lovely conversations we had in preparation for this day. I deeply appreciate it. This is not something that my father would have often had the opportunity to do when we were growing up in Queensland many, many years ago. I'll be honest, when I first started writing this speech and I was thinking about what I'd like to call it, the original title that came to mind was How Racism Caused Climate Change. And then I thought, it's a bit blunt and straight to the point, isn't it? Especially for an arts conference. I mean, the least I can do as an artist and as a poet is to craft the narrative around it and soften the blow a little bit and use a bit of poetry here and there and eventually land on that point rather than going straight to what we actually want to say. It's kind of like how we say border protection instead of white Australia policy, or how we use the term offshore processing centre rather than concentration camp. You know, things like that. There's a bit of ring to it. We say hard-working Aussies when what we really want to say is white Australians. And we say queue jumpers when we really mean refugees legitimately seeking asylum. Ethnic cleansing instead of genocide. These terms, these euphemisms allow us, as artists and as politicians, to dance around the point sometimes. And I guess that's what artists sometimes are meant to do, right? We're meant to use our mediums to make reality a little bit more palatable and a bit easier to come to terms with. So what I'm going to try my best to do today is to make the cold hard truth a little bit more palatable and easier to come to terms with. But jokes aside, what I am going to talk about today are cultural perspectives and worldviews, and how genuine diversity, equity, and inclusion is a crucial element of any ecosystem to survive and thrive, whether it is a natural ecosystem or a social ecosystem. Until we have true equity, inclusion, and diversity, our ecosystem is going to be imbalanced. I'm also going to talk about the specific role that the artists and the arts sector has to play in creating and affecting social change. We have a very unique role as creators and creatives. And I'm also going to eventually land on the fundamental foundational principles that I believe will lead us as a society towards the prosperous, equitable, sustainable society that we all want to be living in. And so in a way, that'll be my whole of system effective change principles right at the end. How's that for an easy start to our Thursday morning? Not too heavy, just like me, not too intense at all. Let me begin by clarifying that when I make an acknowledgement of country, I don't mean it as a formality. It's not something that I just start my talk or my training session with so I can then get on with what I really want to be talking about. An acknowledgement of country is deeply embedded in literally everything that I stand for. Social justice, equity, economic justice, gender equality, environmental sustainability. We can't really be talking about any of those issues until we acknowledge and come to terms and embed within our thinking the fact that we are living on stolen, colonized lands, and the traditional custodians of those lands have never left and never will. Until that becomes a part of our thinking in every decision that we make, we are going to continue to fail to come up with the solutions that we need as a society for us to be able to move forward. So I'd like to emphasize the fact that the First Nations, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples of this continent not only lived in peaceful coexistence with their natural environment without disturbing and disrupting the rhythms and the flows of their countries, respectively. Not only did they coexist without exploiting nature and commodifying nature, but they also, and this is a point that we often overlook or choose to reject, they lived in peaceful coexistence with 500 other nations on this continent. That's a cultural thing, just to be clear. You see, in the land of the Picts and the Celts and the Angles and the Saxons, bloody clan wars led to the ascendancy of one group over another, and multiple kingdoms were formed. And again, through bloody wars and terror and bloodshed and conflict, those many kingdoms were forcefully merged into one united kingdom. Yet, conversely, on these lands, the 500 independent and different and diverse nations with their own cultures, their own languages, their own traditions and beliefs happen to live in peaceful, relative peaceful coexistence without ever feeling the need that they had to protect their borders or to build castles or to defend themselves from their neighbors. Again, it's a cultural thing. How we respond to uncertainty and hardship, physical or mental ordeals, is culturally informed. How we respond to unannounced dinner guests and refugees seeking asylum is culturally influenced. How we interact with our neighbors and close neighboring nations is culturally influenced. The social construct of gender, how it is informed and enforced, is also culturally informed. How we respond to crime is culturally informed. Our concepts of justice and imprisonment or reconciliatory justice processes is also culturally informed. How we respond to inequity or injustice in our society is also culturally informed. How we see and treat our natural environment and think about our natural world is also culturally informed. The word wilderness comes directly out of the colonialist Western language, which separates city from nature, civilization from wilderness. When we talk about things like rewilding, that's an exclusively Western concept. The idea that something was wild was why they thought they could call this place Terra Nullius in the first place. Now, why are we talking about this? Why am I stating what seems to be obvious to some people and might be a bit of a nuance to others? Because the concept of race was created and constructed on the foundation of this idea of cultural superiority. And for far too long, we have pretended that one culture was superior to another, and we've done it for so long that we've now forgotten that European perspectives are also a culture. And what we've ended up doing is we've been fetishizing other people's cultures and diminishing them and reducing them down to their foods and their dance and their song and their artwork, and denying them the right to a worldview and a cultural perspective that might actually be able to help us to solve the complex issues that we face as a global society now. The time has come for us to end the condescending and patronizing way in which we treat other people's cultures, and to realize that all of those worldviews and the ways in which we see our world and think about our world and the languages that inform how our thoughts are formed are an essential part of being able to actually resolve the problems we face in a true, cohesive, systems thinking way. Now, hand in hand with the realization that the cultural perspectives and worldviews of oppressed, marginalized, colonized, excluded peoples needs to be included in decision-making processes comes the realization that the social construct of white is also a cultural perspective that is not neutral, it is not objective, and it is not unbiased. It is also a cultural perspective. We see by diminishing and fetishizing other people's cultures down to their arts, we get to pretend that whiteness is neutrality, and we get to pull the wool over people's eyes, so to speak, so that the true initial reason why we created the construct of race can remain in place, which was power. Every thought, idea, policy, academic research, and how we interpret that academic research is culturally informed, and the time has come for us to realize that whiteness is a cultural perspective, and that if that remains the dominant perspective through which decisions are made, we will not find the solutions that we so desperately need as a global society. This is not even about demonizing another culture and finger pointing and saying that your culture is inferior, because we've seen what that leads to. This is about recognizing that as a human race, we are facing deep structural issues as a society, economically, ecologically, socially, that we cannot solve with a singular cultural viewpoint. When a group representing 25% of this nation's cultural perspective, i.e. straight white men, take up 95% of corporate management positions and 99% of political leadership positions, then we have a deep, deep imbalance that we need to resolve. That is the cultural shift that we actually need in order to restabilize our society, balance our environment and our economy, and actually see to the needs of humanity. This kind of imbalance, this kind of disparity where 25% take up 95% of the space does not happen by accident, and we need to finally acknowledge that. This is a remnant, a vestige of previous worldviews that are outdated now, but those systems and structures are still in place. And evidence of them is all around us, everywhere we look. This is why we need to understand this concept of cultural perspectives and how whiteness, as much as it is a social construct, is still a cultural perspective, a lens through which we look at the world. Conversations like regenerative design and rewilding and sustainability, these are exclusively Western constructs. First Nations peoples didn't have to consider what word to give regenerative design because they didn't cause those problems in the first place to then later solve. Their worldviews were completely different. The way they interacted with their natural environment was completely different, and it was informed by their cultures. Now, even when we are specifically considering the arts component of culture, not the worldview, but even just the arts, we've got to admit that it's not just about what we create, but why we create art is also culturally informed. It's not the same across the face of this planet. For some people, practicing their dance and their culture and their song and their language is about cultural transmission and survival. It is resistance against continued colonization that has never really ended. It is about saying that we are still here and this country is still ours and you will never silence our voice. For others, their art is simply a combination of their embedded cultural appreciation for beauty and pure practicality. They finely craft handmade shoes and coats and bags with brightly colored dyes from the furs of animals within their environment and dyes that come from the natural environment, because that's the most practical thing to do. And then someone else with an external perspective calls that art and commodifies it and decides to make it an article of fashion. For someone else, practicing their art is a way of practicing their spirituality and drawing nearer to God and their Creator. So their song, their poetry, and their dance is a way of expressing their humility and utter nothingness and self-effacement before their God. For others, the reason why they create art is to affect social change and to add momentum to a social movement that might bring back their fundamental human rights. Whether we consider the poetry of Gil Scott-Heron in the Civil Rights Movement and the writing of James Baldwin, or whether we consider the music of the anti-apartheid movement, or whether we consider the hip-hop of Tupac and Biggie, or Childish Gambino or Briggs. For some people, the reason why they create art is for social justice. For others, art is a medium of self-expression and self-exploration of their personal thoughts and feelings, and it's not so much community-informed. It's a case of, what do I write songs about when I don't have to consider my oppression and exclusion from society? And it becomes a much more individualistic form of artwork. So you see, it's not just about what we create, but why we choose to create art is culturally informed. And these are not absolutes, of course. Every culture, every individual, to some degree, will practice and create art for any number of those reasons, to some degree of more or less. Now, what has this all got to do with effective change and a whole of ecology approach, you might be thinking? And why can't you just talk to us about your Persian heritage and how that influences your poetry is probably in the back of some of your minds. Well, no, that's not what I'm going to talk about, because that's not my worldview and my reason for creating art. You see, from my perspective and my worldview, art is a tool and a medium for affecting social change also. And in a world that is riddled with such deep social justice issues and ecological issues, now more than ever, we need art and artists to stand for something more than self-expression. There is nothing wrong with expressing ourselves, but we need to recognize that there is a world in need, and artists have the means to provide that. Now, more than ever, we need to help artists and facilitate this conversation through the medium of all of the arts to be able to establish the peaceful, just, and prosperous society that we all know we deserve and can feel in our hearts is coming. Now, to explain how all of this is connected and bring it back down to the fundamental principles that I feel we need for whole systems change, we actually have to go back to the life of a teenager in Iran in the mid-70s. As some of you may have worked out, that teenager is my father. And as a teenager in Iran, he used to handwrite flyers and screen print posters to elaborate on the basic fundamental principles of the Baha'i faith, which was his religion. And he used to stand on street corners to spark conversations with people about these basic principles of the equality of the sexes and the elimination of the extremes of wealth and poverty and the oneness of humanity and the singleness and oneness of all of the religions as well. As a 12-year-old, you see, he self-taught himself how to paint oil on canvas, and he used to sell those paintings, and with those proceeds he would buy more supplies to handwrite more flyers and screen print more posters. Each time he was doing this, he was putting his life at risk, and this was something he was fully aware of. But nevertheless, he continued to do this. Inevitably, eventually, he was arrested, and he was thrown into the back of a van by the secret police and taken to prison as a teenager. He was kept in prison for a number of weeks, where he was tortured, interrogated, and intimidated, and asked to recant his faith, which he, of course, did not do. And eventually, after being kept there for a matter of weeks, without the knowledge of his family as to where he was eventually released, tortured, but released, with a promise that if we ever find you on the street speaking about these principles ever again, we're going to target your 6 other siblings. Knowing himself well enough and realizing that he wasn't going to stop teaching these teachings, he decided to remove himself from his mother country, and as a teenager, at the age of 18, he fled Iran, across the border into India. Coming from a poor family of 7 siblings and 2 parents, he didn't have the means to support himself. His family didn't have the means to support him while he was living in India. So he managed to not only enroll himself into a fine arts degree at the University of Lucknow, but he also managed to learn how to sketch fast enough at the train station so he could occasionally sell a sketch of somebody to them before they managed to catch their train, and that's how he used to pay for meals. He eventually finished his fine arts degree in his 4th language, Hindi. And 4 years later, when my mother's family escaped Iran during the revolution, they met in India and were married and continued their life of service. My mother and father were still refugees at this stage, and my father continued using his skills for the promotion of these principles that he believed in: the equality of the genders, the oneness of humanity, the elimination of the extremes of wealth and poverty, and the singleness and oneness of all religions. He opened up an art studio. He not only continued screen printing, but he taught others how to screen print. He began sculpting and was soon being commissioned to sculpt statues of Mahatma Gandhi and other notable figures within India. He opened up a theatre school and began not only writing and directing, but also acting in theatre to express issues of social justice and social change. Because in the illiterate parts of the regions where he was living, the flyers and posters that he used to write were no longer useful. So he decided to use the medium of theatre instead. Eventually, 6 years later, when my father and mother were granted refugee status, they moved to Australia, and they moved literally down the road to Devonport. My sister was born in Devonport. What do you think my father's first job was after they achieved refugee status here in Australia? His first gig. I don't have to say it out loud. The Migrant Resource Centre manager of Devonport. Without skipping a beat, he put himself to it again, helping other refugees and asylum seekers settle into this new country in his now 5th language. Eventually, we moved to Townsville. After we moved to Melbourne for a short period, he did his bachelor's and his master's in education in Melbourne, where that lovely university lecturer pointed him out in that theatre. And then we moved to Townsville, where he took on the role of the director of the Townsville Migrant Resource Centre, and he launched the Townsville Cultural Fest, an event that has been going on for 26 years now. Has gone from a few hundred people in a park with 3 food stalls and 6 performing groups to a 5-day event that hosts tens of thousands of people with performers from the traditional owners, the Bindal and Wulguru Kabar people, to traditional custodians of all parts of this country, to South Sudanese, Somali, Ugandan, Ghanaian, Fijian, Tongan performers, groups from Tokelau, groups from PNG, groups from Philippines, from Malaysia. Over 300 different community groups were involved in this event that was completely self-funded and never, ever, ever underwritten by anybody. And in a hostile environment where certain powers to be didn't even want us to continue. And they resented us and left us to ourselves largely until, of course, we dared have the audacity to include with traditional dances from Australia and Papua New Guinea, along with performers like Regurgitator, Tash Sultana and Sticky Fingers. Because that's when we dared enter the mainstream. That's when we were talking about cultural diversity as if Australian culture coexists with all of these other cultures. And that's where we were overstepping the bounds that were expected of us. And still to this day, after having run that event against all odds and grown that event, my father has not learned how to let up. And during COVID, when he wasn't able to put on the festival last year, he continued building his oversized sculptures, like the Rainbow Serpent in Bowen and Townsville, and the Eagle Totem in Mapoon and Arakoon. And he built a giant laughing kookaburra that he then toured around the country along with his giant koala, and he's now talking cockatoo. So even in his 60s, he has not let up, and he has refused to not apply his skills in the arts in whatever way, shape or form he can to affect some form of social change. And you see, that's what informs my worldview and how I see art. So, what's this all got to do with systems change? Well, you see, I eventually started working with my father in these spaces as well. And I also began directing festivals with him. I took on the role of stage manager, and then site manager, and then program coordinator, and then event director of the Townsville Culture Festival. I worked in youth engagement, in cultural revival projects. I've eventually started working with NGOs larger and larger, from local community groups to international NGOs. I finally completed my master's in communication for social change, which then allowed me to work with organizations like Amnesty and Red Cross and their communication, whether they're communicating for climate change or whether they're communicating for refugee rights. Over the course of the years, I worked in a whole range of different areas, from empowering environmental activists to advocating for gender equality through events that I organized and panel discussions that I curated, and teaching eventually economic justice courses online, and eventually facilitating anti-racism training for not just school students but for teachers and university lecturers, and cross-cultural communication training for emergency services and police officers. Not because at the time I knew how all of these things were interconnected, simply because I didn't know how to say no. But eventually, through my experiences, through my learnings, through my conversations with my friends and colleagues in all of these various spaces, it began to dawn on me how all of these different, seemingly disparate social justice issues are actually all very much so interconnected and underpinned by some core fundamental issues. And to explain how that came to be, I've got to tell you about the life of trees. Recently, I mean a few years ago, I came across the research and then the book and then the films about the secret life of trees, and how beneath the surface of the earth, the trees' root systems are all actually interconnected. Not just through their roots, but through the mycelium networks that connects one tree's roots to another tree's roots. And those trees are then interconnected to other species of trees and plants as well. Not just connected so they can be connected, but connected intentionally so they can share resources amongst themselves. And not in the way that we human beings have begun sharing resources, like bartering one thing for another. These trees share resources with one another in order to achieve a state of equilibrium across the forest canopy. So when one tree has access to particular nutrients that another tree doesn't, it sends those nutrients along the mycelium network to another tree. When one tree is larger and is gathering more sunlight, it sends energy through that mycelium network to a smaller tree, because it recognizes that eventually it will become old and sick, and that smaller tree will be strong, and it will be able to help it heal from sickness. These trees are reaching a state of equilibrium because they understand that that is how an ecosystem survives and thrives, and that is how they can best serve their own individual purpose. No tree invades another tree's space to take up its resources, because it knows, without even asking for it, the other tree will give it whatever resources it needs. Not only do these trees share resources with one another, they share information freely as well. You see, some trees have an ability to be able to turn on certain chemicals within their leaves, so when they are being eaten too vigorously by a particular animal, they can change the taste of their leaves, so they become a bit more bitter. So when one tree, or a group of trees in one area of the forest, are being eaten by giraffes too much, They change the flavor of their leaves and then send a message through their root system and the mycelium network to trees way down saying, hey, there's a herd of giraffe coming through, we might want to prepare for them. And in doing so, they help the entire ecosystem. The giraffes get to eat as much as they need, and the trees get to make sure they don't get damaged. This is when I realized that as us human beings try and work out how we can solve the complex problems that we now face economically and ecologically, and try and work out how we can save the environment, it is actually our natural environment that is telling us exactly what we need to be doing in order to save ourselves. This awareness of their unity and their singularity and their foundational, fundamental oneness is one of these core principles that I was talking about earlier, that we as human beings have not yet established. And these diverse issues that we all face, that we are trying to solve independently, and as artists we also try and touch upon and articulate in our work, are all actually interconnected. We have not yet established our fundamental oneness and unity. And the very cultural perspectives that have lived by those principles be oppressed, colonized, demonized, and remove their children from them, and now we refuse to allow them seats at the tables where decisions are being made, and instead we fetishize their cultures and we pat ourselves in the back. This is a fundamental shift in culture that we need, not for the sake of justice and morality, but just to save the human race and civilization and to mitigate suffering as much as we can. No longer can we afford to allow one single species within the ecosystem dictate how we navigate this planet and the problems we face. We have to finally and firmly establish the oneness of humanity, the equality of the genders, the oneness of all faith systems and spiritualities, and eventually include equally, side by side, all of the diverse cultural perspectives and worldviews that have flourished on this planet for so many millennia, in order for us to finally be able to create that just, equitable, balanced, prosperous society, so that we can finally achieve the true capacity that human beings are capable of. And that is what I would like to leave you with. In any way that you can, in your work, in your art, in the ways in which you fund projects, in the ways in which you make decisions, in the ways in which you choose leaders or board members, try to intentionally shift the balance of power that has been lasting since colonization in this country, for us to finally be able to co-creatively design the world that we all want to be living in. Thank you all so much for your time and presence. Much love.
I think Irfin might need a glass of water after that one. Thank you so much. Now we move into question time. So if there's any questions in the room or online, we'll send those through Slido. But I might actually be cheeky.
You want to start with a question?
Yeah.
Go for it.
It's been burning a little while for me. Is there mic on? Great. I'll let you grab some water first.
No, you're right. Go for it.
I'm very curious in regards to your thoughts about acknowledging and integrating other ways of being and seeing. There are a lot of projects around at the moment in particular that have come out of very colonised systems like education or politics, for instance, that essentially set up a structure where they're asking First Nations people to see how well they can be at being white.
Exactly.
Rather than saying, I respect your sovereignty and I respect your ways of being and seeing as an equal to me.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely, yeah, totally. So we can't ever take on board someone else's cultural perspectives and represent them. That's not how it works. Our worldview is something that's deeply ingrained in how we think and see our world, and it's not just about taking someone's opinion and then feeding that back up to the board, nor is it about including or involving someone in a system or a structure that has its own very strong cultural systems already.
right? So our corporate space is a reflection of white cultural values. And anything that doesn't fit into that doesn't do very well in that space. And that's might come as a surprise to some people, but to anyone of color, Indigenous, First Nations, anyone else who's been colorized or diversified, understands that fully well, that you leave parts of yourself at home when you go to work because you're aware that they're not welcome there, and you're not rewarded for that. You put yourself at risk by actually bringing in your cultural perspectives, by actually bringing in your real, true self. And that's a bit of a silent rule that we all kind of abide by. And across gender, the same thing happens. You know, if people step outside of the gender constructs that society has enforced upon them, then they're punished for that. When a woman shows passion in a meeting, that's someone stepping out of the cultural norm of what that gender stereotype should be like, so they're punished, whilst if a man does it, they're rewarded. So we all have these silent rules that we work through, and that's why just including someone on the board doesn't mean you've shifted the cultural perspectives. We've got to acknowledge that our workplace cultures are informed by the people who have been running those workplaces for several centuries.
I think that also really hooks in nicely to the metaphors that you were making about trees, is that you really want to create the conditions for that tree to thrive.
Exactly. Yeah.
Not just adapt to be exactly like us.
Yes.
Yeah. I love this kind of work. It gives me the tingles. We've got some beautiful shout-outs. Are there any questions here? Oh, Bunjalung. Hey, Bunjalung country. I was born up in Lismore. Erfan, do you have any tips of how, like the trees, to absorb the informations of all the cultures?
Yes, I guess that's kind of responding to the same question you asked. So I think, same answer. We've got to acknowledge that white, even though it's a social construct, we've fabricated the idea that there's a white race and a black race and a yellow race and a red race and a brown race. That's not colours I'm making up. That's literally the colour hierarchy that Carl Linnaeus came up with, that Western Europeans then enforced on the rest of the planet. So we've got to acknowledge that those social constructs have been created, and that they each mean something, and that people from those different groups have had an influence on how our society runs. And until we acknowledge that, we are not going to be able to include other people's cultural perspectives, because for the time being, it's like, okay, I'm a straight white male, so my perspective is neutral and unbiased. I've got no cultural perspective. What's your cultural perspective, Mr. Colour? We've got to get over that and realize that we can't talk about people like yourself and myself and others as if you're diverse. What's your diverse opinion? What's your diverse opinion? Okay, now let's go back to the neutral. We've got to understand that everybody is always speaking about whatever they're speaking about from their cultural perspective. And then we can really start mixing things up properly. Yeah,
indeed. I wanted to share a little bit from something that my ancestors did many, many years ago. One of my bloodlines is Métis. It's a Canadian culture. And many years ago, the native Cree people looked at the French fur traders. And the fur traders looked at them, and for matters of business at the time and trade, they looked at each other and they recognised each other's sovereignty. And what came of that is a culture that has a language, it's a mixture of Cree and French, and a language of culture, of dance, that is the most incredible mix of native dance and fiddles. Yes, yes. And these sessions go all night. Like, it's a big occasion when the fiddles come out. So I'm always curious about that combination and what can be created as something more than all of us.
Yes, that's so true. It's like, in systems thinking, it's the concept of emergence. So it's something that is qualitatively greater than the sum of its quantitative parts. And that's what we should be striving for. It's not about being a social justice warrior and demonizing someone else and pointing the finger and saying, your culture is inferior, ours is superior, and we now need, this cultural perspective to supersede. It's like, actually, no, there is something that as human beings we have not yet achieved, that we are all trying to get to, and the emergent outcome of all of these cultures coming together will actually create something that we haven't even imagined yet. And that's what keeps me going in my work, is the hope of potentially myself and maybe my grandchildren one day being alive when that world finally comes to be.
Hells yes.
How are we going? Are there any questions?
Yeah. Oh, hang on. In a holistic way, can artists be personally expressive as
Absolutely.
well as being concerned and make work for social change? How do we provide more capacity for everybody, traditionally acknowledged artist or not, to creatively contribute to a holistic change?
Absolutely. So as I said before, those different reasons why people create art are not absolute. They're all relative, and to some varying degree, we all display some of them. So someone can create art as cultural resistance, as well as spirituality, as well as self-expression. So it's like, they're not absolute. You don't just fit into one category. As far as how do we provide space for everybody, traditionally acknowledged artists or not, to create, well, here's the thing. There are specific groups of people that have been oppressed, marginalized, excluded, colonized, who haven't had the same access to funds and social networks and social capital and the ability to be able to, give their child a leg up through a system. So we do need to specifically take affirmative action to empower those not silent voices, but silenced and oppressed voices. And that's how we're actually going to build the diversity that we need. We can't just say, okay, this is the main stream of funding for mainstream society for everybody, and then we've got a small pocket of fund here for an Indigenous artist or for a Greek artist or for whatever artist. But this is the mainstream, this is unbiased, this is not systemically racist, and there's no structural imbalances with regards to who decides where this funding goes. And then here's your funding, because where that mainstream goes is to people who look like just the same, exactly the same as the people who are making those decisions. So we've got to have that conversation eventually. So I'm happy to start it. No, it's not that I'm starting it. This is a old conversation.
Scott Howie has asked, what do you see as the most workable structure for cultural perspectives decision-making, which is, I think you were kind of starting to hint at there, and what do we replace boards with? Boards are a very colonial construct.
Right, they are, and the way decisions are made and all sorts of stuff. So here's the thing, I don't have an answer to that, because our planet has got around 10,000 different ethnicities. It's not just a matter of 5 races or a few hundred nationalities. We've got close to 10,000 ethnicities on this planet. And every ethnicity, the continent of Africa alone, those nations that the colonizers cut people up into, actually account for hundreds and hundreds of ethnicities. And each one of those different groups had different ways of discussing justice or consultation or collaborative processes or all these kinds of things. So we can't even, like I said earlier, we can't imagine the solutions we're going to come up with until we actually do the thing, which is allowing space for historically marginalized voices. And then, just like nature, it'll show itself to us.
So a board, in a sense, can be a mechanism for collective decision-making and the ability to amplify and discuss diverse views around the table before coming to a decision in which is good for the collective.
Right.
Does that then, I mean, maybe Scott's asking, what is that process if it's not a board?
Who knows? I'm not going to pretend like I have the answer to that one, but we've got to look at how other cultures have done that. How have traditional First Nations peoples, Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people done it here? How have Latin American First Nations people done it over there, and each region and area should look to its First Nations peoples to work out, well, if you've governed and run society on here for 100,000 years, maybe you've got a better idea of how to run things here. So I'm not going to pretend like I have those kinds of answers. I'm just advocating for the diversity of perspectives in order for us to achieve the oneness and unity of society.
Oh, hell's yes. I think we've got a Melissa Robertson. Thank you for changing my day and waking up my senses. I wonder if there's a term/colour for the global humanitarian community that doesn't associate as white or have a First Nations background. How do we fit into the discussion? This is also for the magpies that have 2 dominant cultures. Well, yes.
Exactly. So these constructs are inherently flawed. And they're not true, they're not scientifically backed, and they're not biologically informed. So the construct of white is not a real thing, and the construct of black is not a real thing, and the construct of brown is not a real thing. So, of course, they're going to be flawed and incapable of capturing a whole human being. We've got to shift away from we've got to undo the impacts of the constructs of race, but also acknowledge that we need to look towards ethnicity as a true indicator of a person's culture, because ethnicity represents language, a shared history, shared traditions, and that's sometimes there is some biological truth to the various ethnicities, which, as I said, there's 10,000 or thereabouts of. So inherently, the construct of white is going to be flawed, the construct of black is flawed, and nobody fits cleanly into these things. And in fact, it's changed over time. You know, across different parts of time, you know, Mexicans were considered white in the US for a period, and then they were considered as black, as not white, and then they were considered as white again. And so, like in the US, they had the one-drop policy, which was like if you have a single ancestor that was considered as black, then you are counted as black in the census. So these constructs are arbitrary and ever-moving and ever-changing. So they're completely flawed. What we need to do is to undo the impacts of them and begin respecting ethnicity and eventually the oneness of humanity. So we erase constructs of race, deconstruct constructs of gender, and remove ideas of nationalism, and eventually we get to ethnicity, which is super, super, super diverse, and the oneness of humanity, which is unity and singularity.
It's interesting when there is a dichotomy of black and white for Canadian and American Indigenous people, the red is erased in that conversation, whereas that indigeneity doesn't always equal black.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. I think I can understand that sometimes colour as a way of describing is problematic.
Absolutely.
Yeah, because it becomes binary.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Here we go. This is anonymous. As a person of a minority group, how do you handle the pressure of needing to make change for the future, especially when facing roadblocks from the hierarchy?
How do I handle the pressure? Yeah, it's not easy. Sometimes I don't handle the pressure very well. It's not easy. What inspires me, rather, to keep going, however, is knowing that because of the sacrifices of the generation previous to myself, I now have opportunities like this that weren't afforded to my father. He had to struggle his whole life to make something of himself, and he did. He eventually got the Order of Australia Medal for his services, but he had to claw for every single inch. Now, for me, even though it is difficult, I constantly remind myself that it's slightly easier for me to have an impact than it was for my father, and that's what helps me to continue going. But it's not easy. It never is. And no person of colour or person who comes from marginalised or excluded society has the responsibility either to constantly be changing the world as well. You know, you have the right to take a step back and look after yourself just like everybody else does, you know. There are things that are culturally now that just don't involve people of colour because of the pressures that we're constantly facing simply to survive. It's like bird watching is an exclusively white thing pretty much because people of colour don't have the luxury of deciding they want to go bird watching, for example, or hiking or camping. So there are things that we, you know, unconsciously recognize that these are culturally white because there are luxuries that a lot of people of colour don't get the time to even think about. So as people who come from marginalised, excluded, colonised backgrounds, we don't have to always be, you know, creating social change in the world for everybody else and the future generations, thinking about a whole community, because it is quite exhausting, you know, and sometimes it's okay to look after yourself as well in the process.
I think that's a really important point of view to remember, particularly, I mean, we were speaking to a lot of people who might be in positions, for example, that are designing artist residencies, and the expectation that people will
Donate their time for free.
Yes, donate their time for free. Whereas if you're on a cycle of needing to work constantly to pay rent or to look after your family, that's not an option for you. That then becomes something that you're not able to fit into that space.
Absolutely. The corporate space is now well aware that internships are inherently systemically biased, because the fact that you're expecting people to take their summer holidays away to be able to work for you for free is something that only a certain segment of society can actually do. So by doing so, you're actually becoming a replication of the broader social inequities by disallowing access to certain people who can't take time off over summer. They need to get paid to be able to keep up with the rent or help their parents keep up with the rent. You know, so yeah, unpaid internships and retreats where there's no funding for that are not taking into account the systemic inequities that people have to live with day to day.
Thank you. I think we're starting to come towards the end of our session, but will you stay around with us today?
I'll be here all day today and all day tomorrow as well, so anyone who would like to have a chat, please feel free to come up to me. It'd be lovely.
Wonderful. I'd like everyone to join together to thank Erfan for today.
Thank you.
There'll be a quick break while we change over the room. So if you want to pop out, grab a cuppa, do a wee, we'll see you again in about 10 minutes. Thank you.